January 1904. Midtown Manhattan, a few blocks from the river, where winter turns the streets into hard surfaces and the air itself feels rationed. A new building exhales heat. From the outside, it looks plain, almost stubbornly practical. Brick, regular windows, a facade that refuses ornament. But inside, the city's most basic problem is being addressed with machinery. Boilers, pipes, valves, a system designed to produce one thing on demand: clean hot water, delivered at scale, to people whose apartments were never built to provide it. Tile walls hold the warmth. Metal fixtures shine with the blunt cleanliness of institutions that expect heavy use. The architecture is not trying to impress, it is trying to endure. Everything has been arranged for traffic, for bodies arriving in sequence, for towels counted and reclaimed, for floors that can be scrubbed down again and again without pretending this is private life. In the tenement districts, bathing is often a negotiation with space and fuel and time. A room already overcrowded cannot become a washroom. A building built without tubs cannot improvise plumbing. In a city that grows by the hour, hygiene becomes a logistical problem before it becomes a moral one. This is why the building feels almost unnatural, because it is an answer built from outside the tenement economy. It exists because a private fortune has decided that public health is not only a government responsibility, but a civic risk worth underwriting, not with speeches, with schedules, with maintenance budgets, with staff, with the unglamorous continuous cost of keeping water hot when the weather is not. The name tied to it, Elizabeth Milbank Anderson, belongs to a world that does not live like this. Bank money, board rooms, quiet influence, a kind of wealth that normally expresses itself through distance. And yet here it is, converted into a physical intervention, placed in the path of the city's poorest routines. But a single building can only reveal the scale of what surrounds it. To understand why a bathhouse had to stand in for a housing system, you have to widen the frame until the slums become not a backdrop, but a machine. Background New York, at the turn of the 20th century, is not one city. It is a set of overlapping systems forced to share the same streets. On paper, the city is becoming modern: consolidated government, expanding transit, new bridges, new grids of utilities, a skyline beginning to learn how to rise. In lived reality, it is also becoming crowded faster than any clean solution can be built. People arrive in numbers that overwhelm the speed of construction. They do not arrive as abstractions. They arrive as labor. Dock workers, garment workers, porters, domestic staff, factory hands. They arrive because the city is a machine that consumes work and converts it into rent. The geography of that conversion is not random. Dense housing clusters around where wages can be earned without paying, for distance. The Lower East Side, parts of Midtown east of the fashionable avenues, sections of Harlem as the city pushes north. These are not simply neighborhoods. They are interfaces between the economy and the body. The closer you are to work, the more of your wage you keep. The closer you are to work, the less space you can afford. In the tenement blocks, architecture becomes arithmetic. A typical lot is narrow, bounded by the logic of the grid and the value of frontage. Landlords respond with depth and height. Buildings are pushed back into the lot until the interior becomes a place the sun rarely reaches. The courtyard is not a garden, it is a compromise. Air shafts are carved out not because they improve life, but because they satisfy just enough of a requirement to keep building. Inside, the city's density does not feel like crowds. It feels like constant contact. Rooms subdivided into smaller rooms, beds used in shifts, cooking, sleeping, working, and illness contained, within the same few feet. Privacy becomes a luxury that cannot be purchased in a weekly rent envelope. Water arrives to these buildings, but not in a form that makes hygiene simple. Cold water tenements carry the phrase inside them like a diagnosis. You can have a sink, you can have a tap, but bathing is another matter. To bathe, you need space, heat, and time. Three things overcrowded families struggle to spare. A bathtub is not only a fixture, it is a claim on square footage. In rooms where every corner is already assigned, a tub is an impossibility. Sanitation follows the same pattern: present enough to say it exists, absent enough that it fails. Toilets shared across floors. Waste managed through systems that assume careful maintenance and then placed into buildings that are maintained only to the point of collecting rent. Smells, leaks, broken fixtures. These are not dramatic scenes. They are ordinary. They settle into daily life until people forget that it could be different. Public health officials understand the connection between housing and disease long before the city fully accepts it. They see how tuberculosis follows dark rooms and weak ventilation. They see how childhood illnesses thrive where water is scarce and bodies are packed together. They see epidemics not as mysterious punishments, but as predictable consequences of density without infrastructure. But knowing a pattern and changing it are separate skills. The city responds in layers. There is the layer of private behavior, families doing what they can, improvising cleanliness with buckets, boiling water when fuel can be spared, washing children in cold rooms because there is no other choice. There is the layer of private profit, owners calculating how little must be spent to keep a building rentable. There is the layer of reform, journalists, settlement workers, doctors, lawyers, and clergy trying to map the suffering into something the middle class cannot ignore. And then there is law. New York begins to regulate tenements more aggressively, not because it discovers compassion, but because it discovers risk. Fire risk, disease risk, political risk. The tenement is an economic engine, but it is also a potential liability if it produces too much visible misery. Legislation arrives like a tightening belt. Rules about windows, ventilation, light, toilets, lot coverage. The language is technical, written so that it can be enforced, inspected, argued in court. It does not read like salvation. It reads like an attempt to keep the city functional. But these reforms, however necessary, keep colliding with the fundamental imbalance. The city's demand for cheap labor is larger than its willingness to provide humane space for that labor to live. Employers benefit from proximity. Landlords benefit from congestion. Municipal government benefits from stability. And the people living inside the tenements have the least leverage over the conditions that shape them. So the problem begins to generate its own ecosystem of fixes. Settlement houses offer education, childcare, and clubs, tools meant to stabilize families inside unstable environments. Reformers push for inspections and standards. Public services grow in patches. Some neighborhoods get attention, others remain invisible. Charitable organizations appear to handle specific needs: relief for families during sickness, support for new immigrants navigating courts, aid for widows, counseling for workers. The city becomes a quilt of interventions sewn onto a structure that remains unchanged. In this landscape, one idea becomes increasingly practical. If the tenement cannot easily be rebuilt quickly enough, then certain life-saving functions have to be pulled out of the apartment and provided elsewhere. Not as a luxury, but as public equipment. Bathhouses belong to this logic. They are not romantic. They are not even particularly American in concept. They are systems designed to produce cleanliness in a city where domestic bathing is structurally difficult. They acknowledge a reality that polite society often refuses to speak plainly, that poverty is not only a lack of money, but a lack of infrastructure. This is why a bathhouse matters beyond bathing. It represents the moment reform stops being only a complaint and becomes a built environment choice. It is one of the few interventions that can be measured in throughput. How many people can wash today, and how many tomorrow, and how reliably, and at what cost? Yet even this solution, scaled up, raises an uncomfortable question. If you need separate buildings to provide the basics of a decent life, what does that say about the housing system you are leaving intact? That question is where the story begins to shift, from the slums as a moral scandal to the slums as a financial arrangement, and toward the kind of person whose wealth is large enough to treat arrangements like engineering problems. To understand why an heiress could believe she might cure slum conditions, you have to look at what elite money looks like when it is functioning normally. In the Gilded Age, fortunes are rarely piles of cash. They are ownership positions, stakes in banks, railroads, utilities, real estate, insurance, and industrial enterprises. They sit behind ledgers and signatures, behind trustees and boards, behind the quiet routine of interest payments and dividends. Wealth is not only what you can spend, it is what you can keep producing without touching the original pile. This matters because it shapes the kind of solutions elites imagine. A wage earner solves problems by choosing between necessities. An institution solves problems by creating a budget line. A family with deep capital solves problems by founding something that outlives them, an endowment, a trust, a fund, a board that meets on schedule and keeps minutes. The solution becomes a structure. It becomes repeatable. It becomes respectable. Philanthropy in this era does not operate as spontaneous generosity. It operates like governance with a different name. It builds parallel systems: hospitals, schools, libraries, settlement houses, relief societies. It creates rules and eligibility. It decides who gets access, under what conditions, and what kinds of behavior are rewarded. It measures outcomes in the language it knows best: numbers served, costs per person, buildings erected, institutions maintained. New York's elites also live with a constant anxiety. The city's growth is a triumph, but it is also a warning. Crowding produces sickness that does not stay politely contained. Poverty produces desperation that can turn into unrest. Corruption produces cynicism that can threaten legitimacy. The slums are not only an eyesore, they are a potential destabilizer in a city that depends on stability to keep money flowing. So the philanthropic impulse often carries two motives at once. One is genuine concern, often sincere, sometimes personal, sometimes rooted in religious duty or a reformist worldview. The other is a form of risk management. Keep the city governable by reducing the worst conditions without challenging the ownership structure that created them. The most acceptable reforms are the ones that improve life while leaving the basic hierarchy intact. This is the world Elizabeth Milbank Anderson is born into. She does not enter a city as a reformer looking for an audience. She enters a city already crowded with people proposing solutions. Investigators and journalists document tenement life. Settlement workers teach English and hygiene and provide childcare. Doctors argue for public health infrastructure. Politicians pass laws and then struggle to enforce them. Reform is already a field with its own institutions, rivalries, and constraints. What Anderson brings is not novelty. It is scale, patience, and a particular kind of administrative mindset. When you have enough money to make a building appear, you begin to treat social problems as questions of capacity. How many people can you serve per day? What are the recurring costs? How much staffing is required? How do you design a system that doesn't collapse the moment public attention shifts elsewhere? This is where the bathhouse becomes more than charity. It becomes an experiment in durable intervention. A bath is not a one-time gift. It demands heat. It demands maintenance. It demands cleanliness that must be produced continuously, or the whole structure becomes a symbol of failure. The building does not only need funding, it needs management. And management is where elite wealth feels most comfortable, because management resembles the world of banks and boards. But the bathhouse is also a compromise. It accepts that people are living in housing that cannot easily provide this basic function. It meets the problem where the system has left it. It provides a patch rather than a reconstruction. And because it is a patch, it also becomes a kind of quiet admission that the city, left to its own incentives, will not fix the tenements fast enough on its own. This is why Anderson's story cannot be told as a simple tale of benevolence. Her interventions exist inside a landscape of structural constraint: landlord profit, political fragmentation, enforcement limitations, and the sheer momentum of immigration and urban labor demand. Even the most ambitious reforms have to move through committees, budgets, and municipal realities. They have to compete with other priorities: transit expansions, bridge projects, policing, schooling, and the endless maintenance of a city that is always breaking down as it grows. The most effective elite reformers learn to operate indirectly. They fund institutions rather than individuals. They support legal frameworks rather than personal rescue. They build demonstration projects that can be copied by government later. They place money into organizations that can keep operating without constant attention. This is where Anderson begins to stand out. She is associated with a kind of giving that looks less like charity and more like civic engineering. Not just feeding people for a week, but building a facility and ensuring it stays open. Not just pity, but permanence. Not just relief, but systems that reduce predictable harms: disease, lack of legal support, lack of basic services. And that approach carries its own tension. Because when you treat slum life as a system to be managed, you risk turning human suffering into a problem of throughput and efficiency. You risk designing solutions that make the city more survivable without making it more equal. You risk building institutions that relieve pressure so thoroughly that the deeper incentives never get challenged. In other words, the same administrative discipline that makes a project endure can also make it incomplete by design. Anderson's fortune gives her a kind of freedom: freedom from electoral cycles, freedom from annual municipal budgets, freedom from needing public approval to keep a building warm in January. But it also ties her work to the limitations of the class that produced that fortune. The work can soften outcomes. It can reduce death. It can make life slightly less brutal. Whether it can cure the slums is a different question. That question becomes clearer when you stop looking at the city as one story and start looking at it through multiple lenses: power, money, architecture, hierarchy, influence, and the ongoing cost of keeping any reform alive. Power in New York is not always exercised through elections. Often it moves through boards, committees, and buildings that function like civic infrastructure even when they are privately funded. In the slum districts, the official city is sometimes the weakest presence. Too few inspectors, too little enforcement, too many emergencies arriving at once. Philanthropy steps into that gap and begins to look like a second administration. It decides priorities. It chooses neighborhoods. It funds staff whose work becomes routine rather than crisis-driven. It creates institutions that residents learn to depend on in the same way they depend on streetlights or transit, quietly, until the system fails. Elizabeth Milbank Anderson's approach fits this pattern. A public bath is not merely a service, it is an operating system. Someone sets hours, someone enforces order, someone maintains hygiene standards that are not optional. There are rules about access, behavior, and pace. The building becomes a regulated environment in a city where the unregulated environment outside is precisely what makes people sick. This creates a distinct kind of authority. It is not coercive like police power, but it is still power. The power to define what help looks like, what dignity is permitted to cost, and who must adapt to the rules of the institution in order to receive the benefit. And because the institution is funded privately, it can outlast political moods. It does not need to win votes. It needs to keep its endowment intact, keep trustees aligned, keep expenses controlled. This makes the intervention durable and also insulated. The people most affected by the system rarely control the system. In this way, reform becomes a form of governance that rarely calls itself governance. It stabilizes neighborhoods without redistributing ownership. It reduces suffering without shifting the balance of power that produced the suffering. By the time you notice what is happening, the city has gained a parallel set of civic tools, quiet ones, built not by public mandate, but by private will. And the fuel for that will is money that behaves differently than wages ever can. A large fortune is not simply a larger version of a paycheck. It is a different instrument entirely. A paycheck is consumed by necessities. A fortune invested well recreates itself. It produces annual returns that can be redirected into projects without touching the principal. This is what makes an endowment so powerful. It converts a personal decision into an institutional habit. It turns charity into something more like a utility, predictable, scheduled, repeatable. It lets a single individual influence the city long after their own preferences would normally fade with time. For a reform project, that distinction matters. A soup kitchen can run out of money next month. A bathhouse cannot be allowed to run out of money without becoming a public embarrassment and a health hazard. It needs heat in winter, staff year-round, repairs that cannot be postponed until a donor feels generous again. It must function on ordinary days, not just in moments of moral attention. An endowment makes ordinary possible. It makes the unglamorous expenses legible and fundable. Salaries, cleaning supplies, fuel, maintenance. It pays for the part of reform that most speeches avoid, the part that turns ideals into schedules. But the endowment also locks in a worldview. It assumes a stable financial system that keeps producing returns. It depends on markets behaving, banks staying solvent, trustees remaining competent. It assumes the donor's original strategy is the right one, and that it should continue even as the city changes around it. That is why endowment philanthropy carries an inherent tension. It can be adaptive, but it is also conservative in structure. It is designed to preserve itself. It prefers incremental effectiveness over radical disruption. For Anderson, this kind of wealth creates the possibility of long-range intervention. It also creates the limits of that intervention. You can fund relief and services and public health measures for decades, but you are still operating within a city whose core economic incentives remain intact. The money can flow continuously. Whether it can flow deeply enough to change the engine is another matter. That question becomes sharper when you look at what Anderson funded not as symbols, but as physical environments. A bathhouse is a moral statement only by accident. Its real language is architecture. It is built to move bodies efficiently through cleanliness. Entrance, check-in, a controlled progression through rooms that are easy to supervise and easy to sanitize. The tile is not decoration. It is a surface chosen because it can be scrubbed repeatedly without degrading. The plumbing is not hidden. It is the building's core technology. Heat is not atmosphere, it is function. This matters because tenement life is defined by its lack of designed pathways. The tenement is an improvisation stacked vertically. Too many people, too little ventilation, too few fixtures. The bathhouse reverses that. It organizes the act of bathing into something standardized, almost industrial. It makes cleanliness scalable. And in a city where disease spreads through proximity, scalability is a form of public health policy. Every person who bathes is not simply cleaner, they are, statistically, less likely to carry certain infections into crowded rooms and shared stairwells. The intervention does not rely on persuasion, it relies on access. But architecture also reveals what reform is willing to accept. The bathhouse exists because the home cannot. It solves the symptom while leaving the housing structure untouched. It treats the body while the building that houses the body remains the same. This is why the bathhouse feels both humane and unsettling. Humane because it offers dignity in a city that often denies it. Unsettling because it quietly normalizes the idea that the poor will live in housing so inadequate that the basics of cleanliness must be outsourced. In that sense, the bathhouse is a compromise made visible in brick and tile, a structure built to work around a system that continues to produce slum conditions. And once you see reform as an architecture of compromise, you begin to notice that the city's social hierarchy is also built, just with different materials. The slum is not only a place, it is a boundary. For the wealthy, it functions as a nearby world that must be managed without being entered too deeply. It is close enough to threaten the city's reputation and health, but far enough, socially, that it can be described as a separate problem, belonging to them, not us. Reform work often crosses this boundary physically while keeping it intact psychologically. Elizabeth Milbank Anderson's projects operate inside that tension. They are designed to reduce suffering, but they also reinforce a particular order. The benefactor provides the structure, the recipient enters it. The building sets the terms. The poor are not treated as co-owners of the solution, they are users of a service. This is not cruelty. It is the default assumption of elite reform in this era, that the people with education, capital, and administrative experience will design the fix, and the people with need will adapt to it. Even the most practical interventions can carry this hierarchy. A bathhouse offers dignity, but it also standardizes behavior. It teaches the city's poorest residents how to move through an institution without disrupting it. It imposes rules that imply a subtle message. Cleanliness is allowed, but only within a controlled environment supervised by the logic of order. The hierarchy also shapes what kind of reforms are politically safe. Projects that reduce disease and disorder are welcome. Projects that threaten landlord profit or challenge property rights are far more difficult. Philanthropy can relieve the most visible consequences of slum life while leaving the real levers, rent, land value, wage levels, untouched. This is how the slum becomes survivable without becoming solvable. The boundary remains, but its edges are softened. The city continues to run. The wealthy continue to feel protected. The poor continue to live inside an economy built around cheap space and cheaper labor. Anderson's story sits in that precise contradiction. A woman trying to reduce misery while operating within a class system that defines the limits of acceptable change. To see how those limits are enforced, you have to look at influence, the kind that doesn't need a campaign or a podium. Political power in New York is often loud: machines, patronage, public scandals, speeches that pretend the city can be solved with a single law. But another kind of influence works almost silently. It moves through committees, commissions, trusteeships, and institutional partnerships. Large philanthropy is built for this second kind of power. It can fund demonstrations that pressure government to adopt similar programs. It can support organizations that become essential to city functioning. It can pay for research, reports, staffing, and professional expertise that municipal departments struggle to maintain consistently. This creates a feedback loop. Government leans on philanthropic capacity. Philanthropy shapes what problems appear manageable, and the public begins to accept private institutions as permanent parts of civic life. In that environment, an heiress like Anderson does not need to run for office to shape outcomes. Her role is to create proof of concept, to make a service work so reliably that the city looks negligent if it does not expand it, to choose projects that align with public welfare goals while quietly guiding what public welfare is allowed to mean. The bathhouse is a perfect example. It makes an argument without stating it, that hygiene is not an individual moral failure, but an infrastructure gap. That gap can be closed, at least partially, by building a functioning system. Once the system exists, it becomes harder for the city to pretend the problem is unsolvable. But influence also depends on what it avoids. The most durable reforms are those that do not create enemies with deeper pockets: landlords, industrialists, political machines tied to real estate. By focusing on services, baths, legal aid, public health measures, philanthropy can advance reform without directly attacking the structures that profit from slum housing. This is not cowardice. It is strategy shaped by the city's power map. A reform that survives is often a reform that knows where not to strike. And the most revealing test of any strategy is not how it begins, but whether it can be maintained year after year. Reform is often imagined as a single act: a law passed, a building opened, a ceremony, a headline. But what actually changes a city is the cost of operations over time. A bathhouse must be heated through winters. Boilers fail, pipes leak, staff leave, supplies run out, floors crack, towels wear down. Cleanliness requires continuous labor, and continuous labor requires continuous funding. The building is not the project. The building is only the container for an ongoing expense. This is where many reforms die, not in scandal, but in fatigue. Money dries up. Attention moves elsewhere. Small failures accumulate until the institution becomes unreliable, then irrelevant, and finally a closed door. Anderson's model resists that failure because it treats reform as something that must be stabilized financially. The same logic that keeps banks functioning, predictable revenue, oversight, routine accounting, can be used to keep a public health intervention alive. But maintenance economics also exposes the ceiling of philanthropy. You can keep one bathhouse running. You can keep several running. You can fund clinics, inspections, legal support, and relief networks. Yet the slum itself is maintained by far larger money flows: rent collected daily, wages held low, land values rising, families arriving in numbers that overwhelm available space. In other words, the reform effort is competing with an economic engine that never rests. It is an intervention trying to outlast an entire city's incentive structure. This is why the goal quietly shifts over time. Curing slums begins to look too large for any single donor. The more realistic aim becomes reducing harm, creating models, pressuring government capacity, and building institutions that can survive political cycles. And that shift, away from individual projects and towards system-wide methods, is where the story reaches its turning point. Climax. By the early 1910s, the reform landscape in New York begins to change its texture. The first wave of attention, exposés, moral outrage, The shock of seeing tenement interiors described plainly has already done its work. It has helped push laws into being. It has made certain conditions indefensible in public. It has created an entire professional class of people whose job is now social welfare, a phrase that sounds gentle but often means constant triage. Not because no one cares, but because the city's underlying math is still winning. The number of people who need cheap rooms continues to exceed the number of rooms built to humane standards. The labour market still rewards proximity. The rent system still rewards congestion. Enforcement still lags behind the speed of construction and subdivision. A new rule can force a window into a room. It cannot force space into a neighbourhood. This is the moment when a building like a bathhouse stops feeling like a solution and starts feeling like evidence. Evidence of what works in the short term. Evidence of what the city is unable or unwilling to provide universally. Evidence that certain basics, cleanliness, legal support, preventive health, can be produced at scale if you treat them like infrastructure rather than charity. For Elizabeth Milbank Anderson, the turning point is not a scandal or a single dramatic decision. It is the slow recognition that the city is too large to be helped one facility at a time. The bathhouse is a tool, but it is not a lever big enough to move the housing system. It can reduce harm. It cannot rewrite the market. So the work begins to shift from projects that are visible to projects that are structural. You can feel the difference in how the problems are described. Earlier reform language often speaks as if the slum is a moral condition. Later, it starts to sound like logistics. Disease patterns, infant mortality, the spread of tuberculosis through poorly ventilated rooms, the way small injuries become catastrophic when people have no access to basic medical care. These are not mysteries. They follow routes. Stairwells, crowded bedrooms, shared toilets, long work hours, malnutrition, delayed treatment. When a problem behaves like a system, the response begins to look like a system. Instead of asking only, what can we build? The question becomes, what can we coordinate? Public health campaigns depend on routine. Clinics need predictable staffing. Education requires sustained contact. Legal aid needs offices, schedules, lawyers, and a steady stream of cases. Visiting nurses need routes and records. Inspection regimes need training and political backing. Even the simplest intervention becomes complicated the moment it tries to cover whole districts rather than a single address. This is where the wealthy donor's advantage becomes most visible and most limited at the same time. An heiress can fund experiments without waiting for municipal budgets. She can keep a service open through seasons when public attention drops. She can pay for the unglamorous parts, administrators, record-keeping, training, overhead. She can create stability in a city that often handles the poor through instability. But she cannot, by herself, scale a solution to the size of New York. Not without turning the work into something larger than personal giving. So the strategy begins to harden into institution. The key move is subtle. Take the impulse of philanthropy and lock it into governance. Turn a benefactor's preference into a set of ongoing procedures. Build a structure that can make decisions when the original donor is not in the room. Put the work into hands that can meet, vote, budget, evaluate, and shift priorities without requiring a new emotional commitment every year. This is not romance. It is administration. And administration is how large cities actually change. Slowly, by reorganizing what is considered normal. In practical terms, this shift tends to do several things at once. It favors partnerships over ownership. Instead of building and running every facility directly, it becomes more effective to support organizations already embedded in neighborhoods, legal aid, settlement work, public health initiatives, and other service systems that already have clients and routines. The donor's role becomes enabling, stabilizing, and expanding, not reinventing the city from scratch. It favors demonstration over spectacle. A pilot clinic, a neighborhood health initiative, a coordinated welfare effort. These can be studied, measured, adjusted, and then used as evidence for broader adoption. The objective is not only to help the people served by the pilot, it is to prove a method that can survive beyond the pilot. It favors measurement, because measurement is the language institutions trust. How many cases handled? How many visits made? How many children examined? How many families reached? Even when the numbers can never capture what slum life feels like, they can capture whether a system is functioning. And it favors the reduction of preventable harm rather than the promise of transformation. Cure begins to sound less like a realistic goal and more like a comforting word. The city's problems are not illnesses with a single cause. They are conditions created by overlapping incentives. This is where the tone of the story darkens. Not because anyone becomes villainous, but because the limits become visible. If a bathhouse helps thousands, it also reveals how many more are still waiting. If legal aid wins cases, it also reveals how many conflicts are built into the daily economy of low wages and high rents. If a clinic prevents illness, it also reveals the conditions that keep producing illness. The interventions work. That is the unsettling part. They work enough to demonstrate what could be done, and not enough to dismantle what keeps needing to be done. In the same period, the city itself is changing in ways that push reform into a new era. New York's scale after consolidation has already created a governance challenge. Multiple boroughs, uneven enforcement, different neighborhood economies, different political pressures. Transit expands, allowing some working families to live slightly farther from workplaces, but not enough to eliminate crowding in the core districts. Real estate values shift, populations move northward, older neighborhoods change hands, and the slum is never permanently solved so much as relocated, reshaped, redensified. This constant motion makes purely local fixes fragile. A successful intervention in one neighborhood can be overwhelmed by population movement, job shocks, or rent spikes. In this environment, reformers increasingly seek levers that can travel: public health methods, standardized services, institutional partnerships, and the steady pressure of evidence. For Anderson, the turning point becomes a matter of adopting that logic fully. Not the idea that a single donor can redeem New York, but the idea that a fortune can be converted into a stable engine for civic method, supporting the kinds of systems that the city eventually may be forced to adopt at scale. It is a shift from intervention as gesture to intervention as architecture. And once the work becomes architecture, it confronts the hardest reality of all. Architecture must be built to survive time. Because in the end, the city can outwait almost anything except a system designed to keep operating when the original builder is gone. Time is the factor no reformer can purchase outright. Money can buy heat for a bathhouse and salaries for staff. It can buy paper and ink and office rent for legal aid. It can buy nurses' bags, clinic equipment, coal deliveries, soap. It can buy the ordinary continuity that makes services real. But time does something money cannot fully control. It changes the city faster than any single plan can keep up, and it eventually removes the person whose plan started the work. That is the decisive pressure in Elizabeth Milbank Anderson's story. By the middle of the 1910s, New York is operating under strains that reformers did not design. The city's growth remains relentless. War-era disruptions reshape labor markets and household stability. Prices rise. Work becomes more irregular for some and more punishing for others. Families living at the edge of survival feel every fluctuation first because they have the least cushion. These changes do not erase the old slum problems, they layer new ones on top. A tenement that was already crowded becomes a place where sickness and stress compound. A household already managing low wages becomes a household managing uncertainty. Every reform service, baths, clinics, welfare offices, legal aid, becomes not just a support, but a shock absorber. And shock absorbers wear out unless they are engineered to be replaced. This is where philanthropy faces its sharpest test. Not whether it can create a program, but whether it can turn a program into an institution that survives both the donor and the city's shifting demands. For Anderson, the answer is not found in a single public announcement or a grand closing scene. It is found in the administrative decision to formalize her work so it can continue without her presence being required to renew it. That step sounds straightforward until you consider what it actually means. It means taking private intention and turning it into governance. It means appointing trustees, people with legal authority over funds and mission, people who can make decisions, argue, vote, and still keep the work aligned with the original purpose. It means writing documents that define what the money is for and what it is not for. It means creating procedures so that the organization can respond to changing conditions without drifting into irrelevance or becoming captured by fashionable causes. It also means accepting that the original goal, curing slums, cannot be an operational plan. It can be a moral horizon. It can be a reason to exist. But the day-to-day work must become something measurable and survivable, improving public health, supporting social welfare infrastructure, sustaining services that reduce preventable harm, and creating models that can be adopted more widely. In other words, the mission must be translated from aspiration into practice, and the translation changes the story's emotional tone. A single wealthy woman funding visible projects can still feel like an individual narrative, one person acting against a city's indifference. But an institution is not a person. It does not feel pity. It does not grow tired. It also does not carry a human conscience in the same way. It carries policies. It carries priorities. It carries a budget. Once the work becomes institutional, it gains endurance and loses intimacy. The slum becomes a subject of organized attention rather than spontaneous compassion. The suffering that once shocked outsiders becomes a set of categories: housing conditions, health indicators, legal problems, welfare needs. The city's poorest residents remain human beings, but the system that helps them must reduce their needs into forms that can be scheduled, staffed, and funded. This is the trade-off at the heart of elite reform. Durability requires abstraction. Anderson's fortune, converted into institutional form, becomes a way to keep pressure on the city's most persistent failures without relying on the fragile energy of public outrage. It becomes a counterweight to the economy's indifference, small compared to the forces of rent and real estate, but steady enough to matter over decades rather than weeks. Yet the moment you lock money into a perpetual mission, you also lock in the admission that the problem is not ending soon. This is why 1921 matters in the structure of this story. When Anderson dies, the city does not pause. Tenements do not suddenly become humane. Crowding does not evaporate. But her death forces a decision point that every major donor faces eventually. Does the work vanish with the person? Or does it become a permanent organism that can continue operating inside the city's bloodstream? The choice to continue is not merely a tribute. It is an acknowledgement that the original vision could not be completed within a single lifetime. It is the moment the work stops pretending it is a cure and starts behaving like an ongoing treatment. a long-term reduction of damage in a system that keeps producing the same harms. And that is what makes the turning point feel inevitable rather than dramatic. The most honest reform in a city like New York is often the reform that accepts endurance as its primary weapon. Not a single victory, but a sustained presence. Not the fantasy of immediate transformation, but the discipline of keeping services alive year after year, maintaining partnerships, learning from failures, and adjusting to the city's constant motion. In that sense, the climax is not a collapse, it is a conversion. A private fortune becomes a public instrument. But once the fortune becomes an instrument, the story has to ask what instruments can actually accomplish against the scale of the city's housing economy and what they cannot. Because the aftermath of this conversion is not only about what survived, it is about what changed hands, what grew stronger, what remained untouched, and why the original slum system could persist even as relief became more organized. That is where the story goes next, into the consequences, the inheritance of control, and the quiet limits of even the most disciplined philanthropy. Aftermath. After the turning point, the work no longer belongs to a single individual in the way the public likes to imagine. It belongs to a structure. That shift changes the meaning of control. When Elizabeth Milbank Anderson is alive, her giving carries a personal signature, an intention that can be felt in the kinds of projects chosen: practical, durable, designed to reduce harm where the city's own infrastructure has failed to keep up. After her death, intention becomes policy, policy becomes minutes, minutes become budgets, budgets become programs that can persist without a human voice at the center. This is how elite philanthropy survives, by becoming less human and more procedural. Trustees and administrators take over the task of translating mission into action. They decide which partnerships continue and which fade. They decide whether to fund direct services, demonstration projects, or longer-term public health work. They allocate money into systems that look boring on paper because boredom in institutional life often means stability. In the neighborhoods themselves, what people notice is not governance. They notice whether doors remain open. A bathhouse still functioning in winter matters more than the name on the deed. A legal aid office still taking cases matters more than the identities of trustees. A clinic still staffed matters more than the donor's biography. In the lived experience of the poor, philanthropy becomes real only through continuity. And continuity is where the aftermath reveals a quiet truth. Reforms that rely on daily operations behave like utilities, and utilities are political even when they are privately funded. Because once a service becomes normal, once residents depend on it, it begins to shape expectations about what the city owes its people. Even if the city is not paying the bill, the city is still being pressured by the existence of the service. It is harder to claim something is impossible when it exists a few blocks away and works every day. That dynamic is one of the most lasting consequences of Anderson's approach. The projects do not merely help individuals, they establish precedents. A public bath demonstrates that hygiene can be produced at scale in neighborhoods where private housing does not make it easy. Legal aid demonstrates that working people can navigate the courts and resist certain forms of exploitation when they have representation. Public health initiatives demonstrate that prevention is cheaper than crisis when you build the systems to deliver it. But the aftermath also reveals what does not change. Slum conditions evolve rather than disappear. Buildings age. Crowding shifts from one district to another as populations move and rents change. The city's economy continues to rely on a labor force that cannot afford spacious housing near work. Landlords continue to make calculations based on profit. Enforcement continues to lag behind the creativity of those who can extract rent from density. So the philanthropic work becomes, in effect, a stabilizer inside a system that keeps producing instability. This creates an uncomfortable inheritance. When a private fund is consistently effective, it can relieve pressure on government to expand its own capacity. The city can point to philanthropic services as proof that something is being done, even if municipal commitment remains insufficient. The existence of private relief can sometimes delay public responsibility by absorbing the worst outcomes. Yet the opposite can also be true. Durable philanthropic models can push the city toward adoption by making certain standards feel normal. Once a service demonstrates its usefulness, it becomes politically harder to ignore the need for it. The city eventually may be forced to expand similar services because the precedent has been established. This is why the aftermath cannot be framed as a simple victory or failure. It is a reallocation of civic labor. Anderson's fortune does not demolish tenements. It does not erase poverty. But it helps build a layer of social infrastructure that makes slum life less lethal, less chaotic, slightly more manageable. That layer becomes part of the city's long-term operating environment, an invisible scaffolding beneath the visible skyline. And as it settles into place, the deeper question becomes unavoidable. If the original vision could not cure the slums, what did it actually accomplish? And why did the slum system prove so durable even under sustained reform pressure? That question is where the second part of the aftermath lives. Inside the limits, the adaptations, and the reasons the original machine kept running. The clearest way to measure the aftermath is to separate what philanthropy can change from what it mostly cannot. It can change access. A bathhouse changes access to cleanliness in a city where domestic bathing is structurally constrained. Legal aid changes access to the courts in a society where law is expensive. Public health initiatives change access to prevention in neighborhoods where medical care is often delayed until it becomes emergency. These are not small shifts. In crowded districts, access can determine whether an illness spreads, whether a wage earner loses a week of work, whether a family is pushed over an edge they cannot climb back from. It can also change standards. Once an intervention exists and functions reliably, it alters what can be demanded. If residents know a service can operate with dignity and order, the excuse that it's impossible becomes less convincing. The presence of working institutions reshapes public expectations slowly in the way cities always change, through repeated experience, not arguments. But philanthropy struggles to change ownership. The slum is not only a concentration of poor people, it is a concentration of capital behavior. Tenements are investments. Crowding is a revenue strategy. Poor maintenance is a calculation. The core driver is not ignorance of suffering. It is the profitability of space under pressure. To cure slums in the deepest sense would require altering the incentives that produce them. Land costs, rent structures, wage levels, enforcement power, and the political influence of real estate. Those levers are not easily moved by private benevolence because they sit at the center of the city's economy. So the slum machine persists, not as a single villain's plan, but as a stable equilibrium. Employers need labor close enough to arrive daily and cheap enough to keep costs low. Workers accept crowded housing because distance costs money and time. Landlords profit from density because the city keeps feeding them tenants. Government regulates at the margins because full reconstruction would demand political conflict, public spending, and the kind of sustained enforcement that municipal systems rarely deliver without crisis. In this equilibrium, even effective reforms can behave like adaptations rather than transformations. They reduce suffering in ways that make the system more survivable. They can decrease disease, soften desperation, and stabilize families. They can also, unintentionally, help the city tolerate conditions it would otherwise be forced to change more aggressively. That is the darkest implication of the aftermath. That help can become part of the machine. Not because the help is wrong, but because the machine is larger than the help. Anderson's legacy, therefore, is best understood as a shift in the city's operating capacity. A layer of social infrastructure is strengthened. Certain services become more normal. Certain forms of preventive welfare become harder to dismiss. The city's reform community gains tools that are replicable: institution building, funding models, partnerships that endure beyond personalities. But the slum does not disappear. It relocates, reshapes, and absorbs reforms the way water absorbs stones. The skyline rises, transit expands, neighborhoods change, and the poor continue to live inside a housing market that treats them as demand rather than as people. So the story leaves a final tension in the air. On one side is a fortune converted into practical relief, evidence that disciplined money can reduce real harm without waiting for politics to become courageous. On the other side is the enduring truth that housing is power, and power is stubborn. The slum survives because it serves functions the city has not replaced: cheap proximity, high rent yield, social separation, and economic convenience. Elizabeth Milbank Anderson's work does not fail in its immediate goals. It succeeds in the ways systems can succeed. It builds durable services, strengthens institutions, normalizes preventive intervention. But the city that needed those services remains the city that produces need. And when you see that clearly, the only honest closing is not applause or condemnation. It is reflection on what permanence means in a place where wealth can outlive a person, but not outlive the incentives that built the city. Closure. In New York, permanence is often mistaken for stone. A bridge looks permanent. A tower looks permanent. A fortune can look permanent when it is carefully invested and protected by law. But the city's real permanence is not material. It is behavioral. It lives in incentives. What earns money? What protects status? What keeps the machine running without anyone having to admit they are operating it? Elizabeth Milbank Anderson's story sits inside that reality with unusual clarity. She does not approach slum life as a spectacle. She approaches it as a civic malfunction that produces predictable damage: disease, instability, humiliation, preventable loss. Her response is not theatrical. It is infrastructural. She takes private wealth, money designed to reproduce itself quietly, and converts part of it into systems that do not rely on applause: a bathhouse that must be heated every winter, services that must keep showing up on ordinary days, the kind of work that proves its seriousness by continuing after the headlines move on. That is a form of power, not the power to command, but the power to stabilize. And it is also a confession. Because when you build separate institutions to provide basic dignity, you are admitting that the normal housing system will not reliably provide it. When you fund legal aid at scale, you are admitting that the legal system is not navigable for working people without assistance. When you build preventive health capacity outside the home, you are admitting that the home, for millions, is not an environment designed for health. The interventions reduce harm. They do not erase the conditions that produce it. That is the long shadow over elite reform in the Gilded Age. It can treat symptoms brilliantly while leaving the deeper arrangements intact. It can make the city more survivable without making it more equal. It can soften the sharpest edges of poverty while preserving the distance between those who design solutions and those who must live inside them. And yet, the alternative is not romantic. Without these interventions, the city would have been harsher, sicker, more volatile. Families would have paid the cost in bodies and in years. The slum machine would have kept running anyway, only with fewer shock absorbers and more casualties. So Anderson's legacy is not a cure and not a failure. It is a measurement of what disciplined private wealth can accomplish inside a public crisis, a measurement of how far infrastructure can go when it is built to endure, and a measurement of what cannot be solved by funding alone: ownership, rent, density, and the political courage required to reorganize a city's housing economy. In the end, her work does not ask to be admired, it asks to be understood. Because in New York, the most revealing stories are not the ones where the city changes quickly. They are the ones where the city absorbs a fortune, converts it into routine, and keeps moving, still hungry, still crowded, still producing need faster than any single lifetime can fully repair.